In this also quasi-spontaneous video, I would like to trace the evolution of rationalism prior to the period of European Enlightenment, including its origin in antiquity, as opposed to specifically discussing the rationalism of Descartes or Spinoza. I'm rather interested in contrasting rationalism with beliefs in conspiracies, political or otherwise, including the resistance to vaccination and other irrational beliefs such as creationism. I will also suggest that Christianity had adopted the ideas of rationalism from the very beginning, something that seems frequently, in my mind, misunderstood or misrepresented. So I will start at what is often considered as the beginning of rationalism as well as of the theory of evolution in the philosophical school of Miletus of the 6th century before Christ. Its founder was the philosopher Thales, a mathematician who had also observed static electricity caused by rubbing amber, and he had also observed the magnetic force caused by magnets. Of course, he did not have a good explanation for the underlying physics. He argued, however, for using reason to understand the causes of natural phenomena. Among the early proponents of rationalism was also Anaximander, the student of Thales, who had argued that the origin of the observable world was in the apeiron, the unknown, that is the origin of everything. The Greek word apeiron means both infinite and unknown at the same time. And if you think about it, there's no paradox there. The infinite was at the origin, or arche, another philosophical concept that indicates not just the beginning, but also the first principle that cannot be subject to analysis, but which also determines everything that follows. The infinite is so great that it cannot be fully observed without infinite time and infinite resources, infinite observations, and so on. Then only this infinite and by necessity unknown can encompass and pervade all. Aristotle attributes the following claim to Anaximander. Everything has an arche, that is, an origin or is an origin. The apeiron, the unknown, or infinity has no origin, for then it would have a limit. Moreover, it is both unborn and immortal, being a kind of origin. For that which has become has also necessarily an end, and there is a termination to every process. So the argument here is that if something has become and moves from cause to effect, it has an endpoint, and then there's a termination to it, and therefore it is finite. And if it's finite, it cannot be a first principle, it cannot be an arche. The arche, by necessity, is an origin or is beyond an origin. It's something that cannot be finite, it's infinite. Yeah, so that's the idea. Aristotle seems to echo that statement of Anaximander with another statement of his own in another place where he says, since all science is with reason, logos, that is, so the Aristotelian word or Greek word is logos. There's actually no other word in Greek for reason, just logos. There will be no science of the first principles, arche of science. Or another way to translate this is that since all knowledge is with logos, there will be no knowledge of the first principles, the arche of science, because we cannot use logos to examine something that happens before logos. Yeah? It's the first principle. So Aristotle is arguing that there can be no demonstration of the first principles. So that in other words, that demonstration must ultimately start from undemonstrated axioms. There is no logos of those first principles, no reason that cannot be explained. They are the first principle. This is a point that will be taken up by the fathers of the church, who often argued with reference to Aristotle's works. Another natural philosopher of antiquity, Heraclitus, a contemporary of Anaximander, is credited with arguing along similar lines, but proposing that logos is the cause of everything, and that through it everything has come to be. Logos is a key concept found in the treatises of Aristotle. Aristotle means by logos something more or less like what we find under the name of reason or rationality in Descartes, Hume, Kant, or Davidson. The word logos is cognate with the Latin legis, i.e. law, but in Greek the meaning is closer to that of natural law, or reason. So logos, that is reason, implies a cause and an endpoint, and it also implies causality. The word was used in several contexts in which we have today separate words to mean a law, a reason, a cause or causality, and also to mean a statement expressing the natural law, such as trees grow from seeds, the seeds being the subject or cause of the object, the tree. Aristotle and others refer to logos as divine, in the sense that laws of reason, such as natural laws, are eternal and universal, whereas human laws can vary from state to state. The New Testament, Book 1, Paragraph 1, Verse 1, starts with a statement on logos, almost quoting verbatim Heraclitus, while echoing also Anaximander and Aristotle. So the Gospel of St. John begins with the words, "In the Arche there was logos." Almost verbatim quotation of Heraclitus. This is the same concept of logos or reason being the ultimate cause of everything as proposed by the three aforementioned philosophers. St. John makes this even clearer by adding that logos was unto God, and through logos everything came to be, and without it nothing ever came to be. Also paraphrasing Heraclitus. Other fathers of the church who lived shortly after made similar statements to the effect of God being the primary principle, or being its cause, the cause of the primary principle. So Aristides, who lived in the first half of the 2nd century, said that God is a spiritual being without beginning and end, one, unnamed, incomprehensible, eternal, immutable, perfect, self-sufficient, creator, unmoved, mover. God has no need of anything. This is essentially a rephrasing of the ideas of Anaximander, of Aristotle, and so on presented earlier, including the idea of the infinity, the unknown, and the first principle being impossible to define or name, hence not being subject to reason. Justin, another Christian writer or father of the church who lived in the 1st or 2nd century, said that God is unnamed because names serve to distinguish one thing from another in the realm of the multiple and diverse. But since God is one and unique, he cannot be named in any way. And I think this also hints to an idea that God does not have a beard, does not live on a cloud. It cannot even be named. It's not male, it's not female, it's not neutral, it's not whatever. It's unique. That's about it. Another Christian writer of the 2nd century, Irenaeus, said that God is one, immutable, simple. He is a being which lacks nothing and has no need of anything, an immaterial intelligence which is not affected by time, so no beginning, no end, no starting point, no end point. Clement of Alexandria defined God by quoting Parmenides through Plato. There are many signs of a being that is unengendered and imperishable, complete, unique, immutable, and without generation. If reason caused everything and without it nothing ever came to be, then what is the Church's position on miracles? Because they seem to contradict natural laws and reason, and these are God's own laws. So the official position of the Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church in any case, is that the Gospels must be evaluated in the light of reason, so that miracles of healing, for example, must be understood as akin to medical miracles, rather than violations of God's own laws and God's own reason. This is in contrast to the previous beliefs, such as those to the 12 gods of Olympus, capable of causing miracles. For the ancients, the world had been created by Uranus and Gaia, it's heaven and earth, and by the sun Kronos, whose name means time. So they had set down all the laws, and in that world were next born the 12 gods of Olympus, who, having nothing else to do with all the hard work having been done for them by their forefathers, playfully violated the natural laws to cause miracles. They had nothing better to do, turning men into stars, or even constellations, or into plants or animals, or taking the form of a golden rain or a bull to seduce a beautiful princess. However, for Christianity, there were no other gods. There were no 12 gods. There was just only the one God, and there was constantly no one who might violate his laws. So there was no room for miracles, for true miracles. St. Augustine wrote that if reason contradicts something contained in the Bible, the biblical passage must be taken as a metaphor. And specifically, he referred to the 7 days of creation as being such an example that they must be taken as a metaphor. So this was not just the case during early Christianity, but remains the case today, with Christ's miracles in healing the lame and the blind being regarded by the Church, the Orthodox Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church at any event, as cases of curing men suffering from incurable disorders, rather than curing people missing an eye or a limb or being clinically dead and so on. And so Lazarus was not clinically dead. He might have had a stroke or a heart attack and was put aside. Possibly he wasn't breathing. Maybe his heart was not beating very, very, very strongly. But I have been told by a Christian theologian, an ordained priest, that Christ did not bring something that was just bones in the ground into life. He brought back a man who had just suffered potentially a stroke or a heart attack. As for the blind and the lame, there is a psychiatric condition called hysteria, already described in antiquity and very often described in the modern medical literature. And in that condition, psychiatric patients, after a traumatic event, may be believed to have become lame or blind. But they're not truly lame or blind. They just have convinced themselves that they're lame or blind. My brother, a psychiatrist, has encountered many such cases, and diagnosing hysteria was able to heal his patients with words alone, knowing he was no Jesus Christ. Where one finds statements where faith must overcome reason, as in Martin Luther's statements and elsewhere, these statements are usually made in relation to the nature of God being beyond comprehension, being a principal cause or first principle, in the same sense as a first principle, which cannot be defined by rational statements. Now, I'm not approaching this point as a theologian. I would not be the best expert. Perhaps likening God to a first cause or first principle is not standard theological terminology, but the general idea is clearly comparable. In any case, Christian doctrine, already from its very early days, based on the many statements of the Church Fathers I have quoted, has been in favor of a rational interpretation of all phenomena, except for the primary principle, God, which, being the first principle, is not subject to reason. In the same way that in inventing a new language, one would not be able to define the first word of that language, since no other words have yet been defined. One cannot define the first axiom in mathematics, or something like the first thing cannot be defined. In a discussion from memory from the days of my youth, a Christian theologian and ordained priest that I already mentioned, he taught theology at a school in Athens, presented the idea of the impossibility of knowing or defining God in the following way. God, according to the Nicene Creed, is the cause of the observable and unobservable. Therefore, to know or define God, one would begin first, potentially could begin first, with knowing what is observable as a starting step. However, he argued that even this part, which seems a much easier task than figuring out, for example, the unobservable, let alone knowing the causes of both of them, the task alone of knowing first all that is observable is logically impossible, and he argued this in the following way. The observable cannot be fully observed by humanity because one would need a number of observations over time and space as great as the universe itself, and there would be no room left, informationally speaking, for the recording of so many observations. The number of recorded observations would match the size of the observable universe and in the past and the future, and that's just for the observable part of the universe. There is simply not enough room to store that information. We need a second universe of the same size. So there would be a logical paradox in God, as the theologian argued also by referring to Gödel's second incompleteness theorem and in other ways, and therefore provided the reason for why statements saying that God can be known are logical fallacies. He also encouraged us not to think of God as painted by Michelangelo for the first time only in the 16th century, that is, not to imagine God as a fatherly figure with a beard living on a cloud, like theologians I quoted earlier also said. So the Christian God does not have a gender or a human form. That was simply how it was painted by Michelangelo for the first time with artistic license and somewhat as a metaphor at a time when most people were literate and had no knowledge of classical or Christian philosophy. Indeed, there is no image of God in traditional Christian iconography, whether as male, female, or neutral, being both a single God and a trinity as it is. And to avoid objections, I'll point out that the image of the Pantocrator in Christian iconography is an image of Jesus Christ, not of God, not of the Father. So for that matter, there is no Christian iconography prior to the 16th century with images from the Old Testament at all, such as, for example, the 7 days of creation that so much ruckus about by creationists. And there are no images in Christian iconography of Adam and Eve, or a paradise with fruit trees and vegetarian lions, a hell where people burn. One finds such representations very late, made by artists just for the laugh of it in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So the Old Testament ideas had been replaced by the ideas contained in the New Testament, and by such statements, for example, the opening of the Gospel of St. John, putting reason as the cause of creation replaces, I think, the 7 days of creation, and the messages of forgiveness and human fellowship replace the 10 Commandments. And I do not want to consider this further. I'm just making the point that the Old Testament ideas are not key ideas in Christianity. But I would rather return to the history of rationalism, which went into a period of dormancy during the Middle Ages, possibly due to a lapse in literacy, especially no access to the classical writers, almost certainly by the populace, lapse in classical studies, possibly because also of the new focus on Christian writings, and the shift from natural philosophy to Christian ethics. But a new impetus was provided by the development of the telescope used by mathematicians for astronomical observations around the 16th century. So the astronomical theories of Copernicus, Giordano Bruno, and Galileo were celebrated in much of the Christian world, certainly in Russia, even by the Church, so in the East, as incomparable to anything known before that time. And while Russian monks actually praised Galileo in Italy, Galileo had faced opposition from the Roman Inquisition on doctrinal issues to do with the right of personal biblical interpretation, as well as for Galileo's proposals of the planets orbiting the sun rather than the earth. Now, what was the objection against Galileo's model of the planets orbiting the sun? There's nothing in the Bible on this point. And so one must look for evidence elsewhere. This was pointed by a Russian researcher who looked into this. There's nothing in the Bible that says anything about whether the sun orbits the earth, or the earth orbits the sun, or who the planets orbit to, and so on. So there's nothing in the Bible. However, we can try and trace a tradition of how this idea might have come about. And the tradition starts around about the time of Claudius Ptolemaeus, known as Ptolemy, more commonly an astronomer of the 2nd century, who described the planets, including the sun and moon, in a treatise as rotating in relation to the Earth, and he had provided mathematical computations and lists in tables with the position of the planets in relation to each other in the past and in the future. His calculations were based on another astronomer, Hipparchus, a previous astronomer, and these computations of Hipparchus seem to have gone back to at least the 2nd century before Christ. Earth had already been determined to be a sphere at that time, and its circumference had been estimated to be within a range that indeed included the correct value for the Earth's circumference. Subsequently, astronomical mechanisms had been invented with Earth in the center and the planets and stars orbiting the Earth. So the only surviving example is that of the antiquity mechanism housed in the Archaeological Museum of Athens. There are wonderful videos hosted on YouTube, especially BBC documentary. I will post a link to that documentary in the video description. That ingenious mechanism was used to calculate the types of festivals, such as the Olympic Games, the relative position of the planets over time, as well as solar and lunar eclipses of the past as well as the future. From evidence that the Arabs later developed similar but simpler mechanisms for astronomical observation, it can be concluded that other such mechanisms existed and had been in use at least until the 7th century when the Arabs acquired the technology. The antiquity mechanism involved a set of gears, moving dials that caused the planets to move in their orbits around the Earth on the face of an astronomical kind of a clock. So you could see this face with the stars and the planets moving around, but using some gears that were behind. You couldn't see the gears. So the movements of the planets were so precisely calculated that indeed it would predict future solar and lunar eclipses, and was probably used by the Church to mark the times of various Christian feasts, such as Easter, which is a moving feast. It's a different time of the year every year, depending on the position of the sun and the moon. Pictorial representations of the face of the type of antiquity mechanism can be found even in medieval manuscripts. So it seems that the reliability of such types of mechanisms, with the Earth at the center, and predicting astronomical events led to the propagation over the centuries of a somewhat unwarranted belief that the planets revolve around the Earth. There is, however, no explicit statement by previous astronomers such as Ptolemy or religious texts or whatever that the stars and planets revolve around the Earth. Galileo's system had been quickly adopted by the Church in various quarters, especially in the East, in Russia, as I mentioned, despite subsequent opposition from the Roman Inquisition and later the Pope. There is a humorous testimony by a Russian monk who rather favored Galileo's theory, and he dismissed the idea that the planets revolve around the Earth, not as based on the scripture or anything else, but as based on the fairy tales of Thomas Endicopleustis, a Byzantine writer who had written stories about unicorns and mermaids. So the development of telescopes, barometers, their discovery of static electricity, and renewed interest in mathematics ushered the age of European Enlightenment, with scientific luminaries such as Isaac Newton, Otto von Guericke, Leibniz, and others making enormous advances in science. Most of them, all of them, I think, devout Christians from what we know about them. Isaac Newton in particular regarded natural laws as the laws of God. I want, however, to end with what is the situation today in our modern age of reason, where scientific theories have led to cars, airplanes, computers, space travel, and to vaccines, heart transplants, and brain surgery. There are still those who would rather believe that everything around us was created within a week some 6,000 years ago by a god with a beard, living near a garden with fruit trees and vegetarian lions. This type of surreal belief is clothed in the word religion to give it validity. There is, however, nothing fundamental about such beliefs. As we saw already, By the 6th century before Christ, there had been a movement to understand the world through reason, which was adopted also by Christianity. The fabulous stories of the Old Testament and the myths of Greek mythology date from an earlier time when, after the Bronze Age collapse, writing had been lost, illiteracy, social chaos, and hardship were the order of the day, and people had no way of educating themselves except through myths, legends, fairy tales, and arbitrary explanations of physical phenomena through miracles and magic. In their helplessness, people must have hoped that perhaps some god might have mercy on them and save them from a world they had no control over. There is, however, nothing fundamental about that condition of humankind, if that is what is meant by fundamental or fundamentalism. We have since the knowledge and technology to face life's challenges better than our forefathers 3,000 years ago, and to resort to magic and surreal beliefs and reject science cannot be justified by calling that religion. Christian charity aside in letting them believe what they want, personally, I find it frustrating that in that state of ignorance, some of these people call themselves Christians, in complete contrast to the actual beliefs of Christians. The objection to scientific theories such as Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection on the basis of an ancient fairy tale reveals a lack of sensibility and good education. However, one has also to discriminate between all religious people and creationists in particular when coming up with surveys to estimate the number of creationists. Is the tree created from a seed? Everyone will say yes. Has the seed and the tree and all life evolved? Most religious people will probably say yes. Even the fathers of the church, with practically no scientific knowledge of the kind we have today, would have said yes. So, has life on earth depended on the existence of the earth? Yes. Has the existence of the earth depended on the existence of the universe? Yes. Has the universe the first principle if it exists? It would be a logical paradox if it hadn't. In the same way that there would be no mathematics without axioms, for example, without the numbers 1 and 0 and the first principle of axioms of the relations between these two numbers. There would be no physics without the principles of matter and energy and so on. But if someone asks then, has God, Dob, Lord, the unnamed or whatever, has that first principle caused the tree? Does it lie at the origin of the tree's existence? Most, if not all religious people, in fact all rightly thinking people, I should say, who think reasonably and rationally, will say yes, there must have been a first principle to the universe, otherwise we wouldn't know anything about the universe, which seems we do. So that cannot be construed as support for creationism. Support for creationism would be if someone, when asked if all trees and seeds and animals appeared on the 4th or 5th day of a week some 6,000 years ago, said yes. But I imagine the number of people who would say yes are in the same ballpark percentage as people believing that airplanes spray us with chemicals to brainwash humanity, or that vaccines are used by Bill Gates to implant us with microchips that control our brains, and so on. Personally, in all my life, I have only come across just 2 people, 2 witnesses of Jehovah, who believed that life appeared without the process of evolution. For the benefit of all, including those swayed by mild paranoia from one camp or another, from one direction or another, I would like to make a proposal that every few days the Google, YouTube, and Facebook search algorithms are set to allow people with internet access to get a broader view of what the rest of humanity thinks, and to give people the opportunity to accidentally open their horizons. Inclusivity and pluralism are not just something that has to do with avoiding discrimination or segregation of particular ethnic groups. It should have more to do with real and meaningful access to information for all in a proactive and unbiased way. Thank you for listening.